Hello and welcome to episode 307 of Hot Media with Bob Mann. For those of you watching the video version, you already see my guest, Dr. Paul Levinson, who is one of our favorites. We'll be introducing Paul in detail in just a couple of minutes. And for those of you who are listening on audio on Spotify and Apple Podcast, you've already heard the intro, so you know what this show is all about. We discuss the hottest content and the hottest controversies in mass media. And we are never lacking for these controversies, Paul. If you don't know the show, Dr. Levinson is professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University in New York City. And he just had a milestone celebrating the 200th episode of his podcast. So thank you for being here, Paul.
My pleasure as always, Bob.
Let's talk a little bit about Squid Game. It is the hottest show globally, certainly the hottest show right now on Netflix. And it has raised some degree of controversy. People say it's very violent. Some people think it is wonderful because it depicts economic discrepancies, at least in South Korea, very much the way the Parasite did. And many people are comparing it to the Hunger Games. In a review that you wrote, you said that this is much more than just the Hunger Games. If you can explain the difference between the two. Obviously, there are similarities, but your review said there's a lot more to Squid Game.
There is, because I like Hunger Games well enough. Although I have to tell you, I read some of the novels. They were never my favorite post-apocalyptic novels in any case. But I liked the novels and the movies well enough. But to me, they were clearly fantasy. And obviously, Hunger Games has relevance to our real world, the game show, many things. But clearly, it didn't feel like something that could really happen, which is okay with me because, as you know, I'm a fan of science fiction, I'm a fan of fantasy. But Squid Game had all the elements of a great post-apocalyptic science fiction story, but it felt very real. And now, part of that, though, is I don't know what life is in Seoul. So it's possible that people who live in South Korea, though I understand they love the series also, but it is possible that people who live there might look at it and say, "Hey, this is very unrealistic. This is no closer to reality than Hunger Games was." But certainly, from my New York American perspective, Squid Game seemed like something that could almost happen in our reality, either next month or maybe it happened a month or two earlier. It felt that realistic. The science fictional aspects, of course, are the sophistication of the facility in which the players in the game are held. But that wasn't really the most significant part of the series. It was indeed, I mean, there were many aspects to it, but one of the things that struck me and I most liked is how everyone needs money. We often think that, well, only, the low class needs money, and they do, and they need money more than people who have more money. But it's not as if people who have, enough money to be considered upper middle class, college educated, and so forth, have no need for money. They have need for money too. And it goes to show you that series goes to show how much someone is willing to do to get money, because as becomes clear, really, I guess in the second episode, uh, a lot of people leave. They're given the opportunity to leave, and that's when I started really taking this seriously. They leave. They know that their lives are at stake. They know what's going to happen, and yet they go back anyway for their own different but very powerful reasons. So there
Well,
were
there's the old expression, Paul, I wouldn't do it for love nor money, because apparently love and life and money are pretty much on an equal an equal stage with a lot of people. But We do live in a capitalist society, and whether or not that is something people support or if they think socialism is a better way, there's no denying that capitalism has its pressures. And I have been through the gamut of the middle class. I have been everything from low middle class to upper middle class, never rich, never poor, but the needs change and the desires change, and you don't want to lose that lifestyle. I could quit my job tomorrow and survive, but I don't want to just survive anymore. Back when I was just out of college, I was happy to have a roof over my head. It changes.
It definitely changes, and the appalling thing, but the very true thing about that narrative is that money is more important than love. I mean, we see that happen as the story progresses as well. I mean, love is still there, but ultimately, most of those people are willing to do anything. I will say that one slight problem, which I didn't mention in my review, but now that I think about it, is it was a little bit of, I think, over hitting the point to what was it, $55 billion or something like that. I mean, I think they would have done it for $55 million. I would have done it for $55 million, but I probably would have done it for five. No, I wouldn't have done it at all. But I mean, I think
It's
that
the old Groucho Marx slide. We've already discussed what kind of person you are. Now we're just negotiating price.
exactly right.
It's really what
So
it is. But there's always the argument about violence, and sometimes, yeah, and I love The Godfather. I've never had an issue with on-screen violence, but there is such a thing as gratuitous violence. Do you feel that Squid Game in any way goes beyond the pale in terms of violence that is not necessary to the plot?
no, I think the violence was necessary, and it was horrendous violence. It was stomach turning in many cases. So I'm not even saying that I liked it, but I think that the violence was necessary to make the point, because this wasn't some kind of British cricket match which actually can be pretty violent too sometimes, but this was literally their lives were at stake, and they weren't going to die, just like falling asleep and never waking up again. So it was brutal, but I thought that made the point very effectively. And I'll also add something else here. As you know, I've said many, many times, I think there is a misunderstanding of the relationship between violence in the media and violence in the real world. There are many people who today still say, after all these years, that although there seems to be a correlation between people who watch violence and even enjoy violence, whether it's in video games or in movies or television shows, they're more likely to commit violent acts in their real life. And yes, there is a correlation between the two, but studies have shown over and over again there is no proof that there's a cause and effect relationship. And it's just as likely that people who have a penchant for violence in real life will understandably enjoy violence in the media. And that's why they gravitate towards that.
And there are all the different subsets of theories, even if there is an effect. Catalytic theory that what doesn't bother one person will very much trigger the other person, etc. And there are too many other factors out there: domestic violence, availability of guns, poverty, etc. That the idea of simply blaming the media. I remember after Columbine, it just happened to be after the Matrix, and people made that direct A to B cause and effect argument, and it really just carried no weight at all. Of course, today they'd be looking through their social media history to see if they had seen it, but still, nonetheless, it's very hard to make that direct connection.
That's right. And interestingly, there was an article, I think that was just published this morning or late yesterday in Salon, which discussed Squid Game in light of the other reason that Netflix has been in the news very recently, and that's the Dave Chappelle controversy, to say the least. It's a controversy because in his stand-up comedy routine, he makes fun of what can happen to trans people. And so there was a hue and cry, which I agree with, saying Netflix shouldn't be putting this stuff out. And there's a connection, though, between that and what we were just talking about, because one of the executives at Netflix said, look, there is no evidence whatsoever that what people see on television or on Netflix can have an effect in the real world. So there's no reason for trans people to be afraid as a result of Dave Chappelle's stand up comedy routine. And I found myself agreeing with Netflix on that point, just on the specific scientific statistical lack of evidence. And in fact, the evidence says the contrary, as we were just talking. I don't agree, though, with Dave Chappelle saying those kind of things, and I wish he wouldn't. And were I head of Netflix, I would tell him, don't. You know, we don't want this on our show. But the point again is, people are always quick to jump on the seemingly common sense view that, hey, if there's something bad going on in the media, people are going to act that out in real life. By the way, one of the first examples of that, which I love, you're probably aware of this, in the 1940s, there were people who were concerned about the fact that if you showed couples kissing on the screen, it was going to give kids the wrong idea. And I remember thinking, what? I was a kid once too. I didn't need to see a movie. Want to do that. So, but
Pretty
and
inherent
this
to
is like
human nature, I would say, and biology. Hey,
exactly
I never
right.
thought of that before. I didn't know that. Hey, listen, Paul, we're at the halfway point, and I wanted to get to something else. We had promoted that this would be specifically about Squid Game, and there's so much more because as we record on October 25th, a Monday, for a publication a little bit later, the cover story in Time Magazine is with the question, delete Facebook over Zuckerberg's face. And the whistleblower right now, Haugen, is in England as we speak, testifying before Parliament. And I know that you're a big advocate of the First Amendment, but you also are not a big advocate of people storming the U.S. Capitol. So as a result of that, I'd like to get your take on the idea that Facebook needs to be regulated by various countries, because there is the dilemma of, you want to protect democracy, but are you destroying democracy in the effort to, keep it from being destroyed? So give us, you've talked about it before, your last visit 6 weeks ago, but give us an update on your feelings about Facebook and at least facing some consequences.
Well, this might sound arrogant on my part, but Facebook is certainly testing my patience. And I'm getting increasingly disgusted with Facebook and furious about what they're doing. And I have no reason to think the whistleblower is making this up. And, one particular snapshot of what she's saying, as you know, is that Facebook did stop stirring things up for a period of time before the election. So they knew that it was not the right thing to do to basically feed people who are insane what they believe is true and get them even angrier than they are. Facebook knew it was wrong to do that. So they stopped doing it before the election because they had enough brains. Uh, the leaders, the CEO, and the cabinet or whoever it is at Facebook that rules that company. So they had enough sense to take that off because they knew that if Trump were reelected, Trump was going to come after Facebook for the wrong reasons. He didn't like Facebook because they didn't give his stuff enough play and because they dared to crack down in some way on Trumpists. So Facebook, certainly the people who are on Facebook are not stupid. They knew enough to take those algorithms out of play, to stop that vicious cycle. But Then
And
what
Paul,
they
they even had something called a civic integrity team, and there's some doubt as to whether or not that was completely decimated or if it migrated to other parts of the country. It sounds a little iffy about the migration to other parts of of the company.
It does, and it seems that Facebook has lied about this. What they're doing is outrageous. What they've done is outrageous. So you can count me as no friend or supporter of Facebook. But I'll just say again, we have to do everything in our power. And I don't like saying this, but at this point, this is still how I'm coming down on this issue. We have to do everything in our power to prevent this country from walking any further down the road of fascism. That's why what Facebook did and didn't do is so outrageous. And I'm still very concerned that if we begin making laws that the government is going to enforce and they're used against Facebook, what happens if Trump is reelected? Who knows what Joe Biden will do? And in a way, there's a relationship of this to should we do away with the filibuster, that whole issue? Because I'm not even 100% sure how I feel about that. I'm in favor of the progressive agenda, but I don't like the fact that if you do away with filibuster in any major way or you seriously weaken it, what happens if the Republicans get in the majority again? It could happen. It could happen in 2 years.
It can
Uh,
have just the opposite effect of what you were trying to achieve. So you can be protecting pro-fascists in an effort to prevent fascist takeover. It's an almost impossible situation in terms of sticking to your pure media theory of free speech and free expression and dealing with those who will just abuse the privilege.
that's right. I think a better way of going after Facebook, which doesn't invoke the possibility of some kind of fascist government control of Facebook. And in some ways, still the most serious thing that Facebook has done is selling user data without getting the explicit permission of the people who use Facebook. And of course, they do that to make their ads more effective because if they're selling their data on their users to potential advertisers, the advertisers know they can target their ads, which actually is part of this problem that's stirring people up politically as well. But there, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has gone after Facebook because what they're doing is, in effect, an abuse of fair trade here in the United States, selling that kind of data. So I have no big problem with that, and I think the government should step that part of it up. But this hue and cry for some kind of government control of Facebook, and I'm saying Facebook slowly because I'm thinking of the other media that will then come under government control, because that's always the way it works. Once you let the government get its foot in, it gets very comfortable. Then there's precedent. So then Twitter will come under government control. And you know what? Why stop there? Let's say there are Republicans in office and they're sick and tired of hearing the people on MSNBC tout the progressive line. Maybe they'll pass a law and crack down on that. So I mean, it is something that is it starts with a very reasonable thing, and then historically can very quickly progress into something that's the complete antithesis of reasonable. So
And go ahead, Paul. Wrap up on this because I wanted to get to your anniversary.
okay, thanks. No, well, so look, I think that the focus, the spotlight should continue to be on Facebook. I'm glad to see that cover. I think people need to be aware of it. I would be happy if users left Facebook in protest of that. So I think that there are actions that can be taken. Advertisers withdraw their advertising. All of that is fine. But I draw the line at this point at the government making laws to crack down on Facebook.
Let's wrap it up. I was very flattered when you asked me this weekend to give a congratulatory spot on your podcast, and 200 episodes. I was telling you before we started recording that I was a little groggy when I did it Saturday morning and had one bad take of 200th anniversary, which would really, I know I'm getting older, but I mean 200th anniversary. But 200 episodes is really great. So tell the audience a little bit about your wonderful podcast and how you felt about getting to 200.
Well, as you know, Bob, like you, I love talking. So podcasting seemed like a natural thing to me. But what I loved about the thought of doing a podcast back in 2006, and by the way, it started in on October 21st or something like that, 2006. So it's literally uh, 15 years since I started it. What appealed to me back then, and what has proven to be the case is, and what I love, since it's my podcast, I can do it anytime I want about any subject I want. And I find that tremendously liberating. The truth is, again, we're both professors and we enjoy coming in and teaching classes, but we can't quite teach anything we want. There's a syllabus, there's a curriculum. If we don't feel like teaching one day, we can't say, hey, you know what, to the class, let's postpone the class until tomorrow. And we get, and
At
now,
least not all the time, anyway.
yeah, everyone, you know what, I'll divulge a secret. I used to teach like a creative writing workshop at Fordham University. And one of the things I had is like a spur of the moment assignment. So go into the class, I tell them at the beginning of the class, sometime during the course of the term, I'm going to come in and say, okay, look, here's an assignment. I'll go out right now, come back in 45 minutes with a story. I did that because either I really didn't feel like teaching a regular class that day, or I had some important thing I was working on. So I go to my office, do my work, come back down and be there. So yeah, you can do that a little bit, but not all the time. But that's the wonderful thing about podcasting, and I have done it on everything. My first podcast was about why I love my Prius. And it wasn't because I'm a cheapskate and I like to save money. You don't have to fill up the tank that much. It's because I loved back in 2006 that I could talk on the phone without having to wear any earbuds or anything like that. The car itself became a phone. This my second podcast was about Battlestar Galactica. I had a podcast about what, speaking of something else that's coming up soon, why I hate daylight savings time, because it gets dark so early. And I think it's the farmers' fault, but people tell me don't blame the farmers. But I don't know. When I was a kid, I said, Dad, why are we turning back the clocks or whatever? And my father says it's the farmers. So I took him at his word. But anyway, uh, the podcast has really evolved in many ways. It's gone through all kinds of cycles. I started out doing 3 or 4 podcasts a month, but again, no fixed schedule. When I got busy with deadlines, writing books, recording an album, sometimes I only did 3 or 4 podcasts a year. But one of the beneficial consequences and side effects of the horrible pandemic and the lockdown was it gave me more time at home. And so I guess it was in the summer of 2020 I really began stepping up the frequency. And the last couple of weeks, there have been so many great new science fiction shows. And for any of your viewers and listeners who are science fiction fans, I would highly recommend the first half of the new Dune movie, much better than the 1984 movie. The Foundation series is excellent, not perfect, but excellent. I even saw a new series, Invasion, on Apple TV Plus, the first 3 episodes, and that's pretty good. And I'm doing reviews of all those. And so I had I had 2 reviews back to back, the latest Foundation episode and the first half of the Dune movie. And today, October 25th, I'll be putting up a review of Invasion. So you can make it as compressed, as many episodes as you want. I know you do things in a more organized way than I do, but I'm totally disorganized. I'll throw in here that Marshall McLuhan once said, when people asked him, you had an issue of your journal expirations. It's supposed to be out like 4 times a year, and basically now like 6 months have gone by. Where's the issue? McLuhan's answer was, I don't like subjecting people to the tyranny of receiving a magazine or a journal in the mail exactly on time. So I took that to
I
heart.
never thought of that as tyranny, to be perfectly honest. But if you're McLuhan, you can say anything you want, I guess, and people are going to say it was brilliant because everything else was. So how? Listen, it was an honor for you to ask me to do that, and I really appreciate it. And what I appreciate most is how often you come on this podcast, as you did on the satellite radio program. You are really a phenomenal guest, and as I said, I'm going to just tell my audience, which is that you're one of the only people I know who can talk about the deadly serious and the downright silly, both from an expert point of view. Usually, if people are talking about the deadly serious, they're deadly serious. Or if they're just kidding around, they can't get to the serious point with some, with some strength. I hate the word gravitas. That's what I was trying to get around. But you can do both, and I have to say that that is rare, and it makes you a great guest.
Well, listen, thank you. My grandkids will tell you I'm silly because every time I make a joke with them, my wife says, "Oh, it's silly, Grandpa." So what am I going to do?
All right. Well, listen, Paul, thank you very much. Always
Okay.
appreciate it when you come on. If you can just hang on a little bit because the video version of this is live to tape. So I don't want to think that I just cut you off completely. So hang on while I wrap it all up. But thank you again, Dr. Paul Levinson, Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University. Thanks, Paul.
My pleasure.
And we certainly would like those of you who are listening or watching to be with Hot Media on a regular basis. I'm at least chained to the weekly podcast as much as I can be right now, trying to build the whole thing. And I would ask you to go to my website. There it is. On the video, www.bobmanhotmedia.com, to find out a lot about the show. The best is really to follow me on Twitter, the handle @BobManMedia, and on Instagram, it is BobMan92. So we certainly hope that you join me on a regular basis as we talk about the hottest content and the hottest controversies going on in mass media right here on Hot Media. Thank you very much for joining us.